One great thing about the book, and again, I'm talking to Ari Berman about his new book, Give Us the Ballot. You can find it at ari-berman.com, is how it literally does show that literally every decade, from the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, all the way to today, there literally has been a consistent assault on voting rights. And it goes to show again and again, like, why the act was so necessary to begin with. You talk in the book, in the introduction. I mean, you mentioned John Lewis earlier, and again, he's someone who was there, from Bloody Sunday all the way to today, who's like, and he's actually a consistent presence in the book all throughout. You write about how John Lewis is testifying in front of the Supreme Court. Talk a little bit about John Lewis and just sort of the experience he had, watching his life's work essentially just get dismantled by a right-wing Supreme Court.
Well, he's really the central character in the book because, number one, there would have never been a Voting Rights Act without John Lewis. He nearly died fighting for the VRA. And the second thing is that he's been involved in this struggle for 50 years. And so many people from the civil rights era have passed away, or they've done other things, or for one reason or other, they haven't maintained an engagement. And Lewis has been engaged all the way through. He was engaged in the 1960s, first with SNCC, and then, with Bobby Kennedy's campaign, and then he was engaged in the 70s when he ran a group called the Voter Education Project that registered black voters in the South at the time when this work was very neglected, to the 80s when he ran for Congress and won election in the seat of Martin Luther King, all throughout the 90s and the 2000s. And then, so to have that incredible accomplishment, to be elected to Congress, to become the conscience of the Congress, to see the first black president elected, and then, 5 years after Obama's election, to sit in the Supreme Court and to hear them dismantle the Voting Rights Act, and to hear Antonin Scalia call the act a perpetuation of racial entitlement, I think was heartbreaking for Lewis. I was with him a day after the Supreme Court oral arguments, and he felt like he was just fighting this battle all over again, that he was reliving some of the darkest chapters in his life, and he felt like we had moved beyond this as a country. And so when he went back to Selma, I was with him in Selma both in 2013 and in 2015. It wasn't just a commemoration for him, it was a recommitment to the struggle of today.
Speaking of the Supreme Court, John Roberts, this Chief Justice when the VRA was gutted, actually has quite a history of fighting against voting rights, dating all the way back to the Reagan administration. It should have been, and for many people it was a warning sign, but so tell us a little bit about Robert's history, because that's actually really interesting how well plugged in he was against the voting rights of African Americans.
Yeah. I mean, Roberts was a key foot soldier in the Reagan Justice Department when they tried to limit the Voting Rights Act. He was a clerk for Justice William Rehnquist in early 1980 when Rehnquist was the leading conservative on the court, criticizing the civil rights laws of the 1960s, wrote some just really outrageous things about civil rights, saying that Plessy versus Ferguson was wrongly decided and all these things. And so it was rightly decided, I should say. And so Rehnquist is someone who is the leading kind of fringe conservative on civil rights issues, but becomes very influential when a new Reagan administration takes over and then becomes Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And Roberts is his protege, and then joins the Reagan Justice Department, and the Reagan Justice Department has launched this broader counter-revolution against the civil rights laws of the 1960s. And Roberts is tapped as the key foot soldier to try to challenge these laws. And at the time, there's a big debate over how to define discrimination under the VRA. But do you define discrimination as, do you need to prove intentional discrimination, or do you need to prove the effective discrimination? And this is a huge argument because the Supreme Court had just said that you have to prove the intent of discrimination to strike down a discriminatory election system in places throughout the South. And that really set a chilling precedent for voting rights. It was the first time the Supreme Court had really weakened the Voting Rights Act. And the Congress was debating about whether to reauthorize the VRA in 1982 and for how long. And many in the Congress, both Democrats and Republicans, wanted to reauthorize the VRA in such a way to essentially overrule the Supreme Court's decision and say you only had to prove the effect of discrimination, not the intent, which would make it a lot easier to challenge discriminatory election systems under the VRA. And Roberts was fighting tooth and nail to limit discrimination to intentional discrimination, and he writes dozens and dozens and dozens of memos about this, and this is something that really, really animates him, both when he's a young lawyer, and obviously we see that it animated him on the court when he became Chief Justice, that his opposition to the VRA had not ebbed. He told Congress that he had no problem with the VRA when he was nominated as Chief Justice, but clearly he has a major problem with the law, as evidenced by his majority opinion gutting it in 2013.
You mentioned reauthorization, and that's actually something I think maybe not many people actually know as well, is that the VRA was actually reauthorized by Congress 4 times. Discuss what were some of the major changes to the law the 4 times that they were that it was reauthorized by the Congress.
Well, yeah, the act was reauthorized 4 times, and all 4 reauthorizations were signed by Republican presidents with overwhelming Republican support.
Right.
And I think people don't realize that. And every time it was reauthorized, the law was strengthened. In 1960, despite Richard Nixon's opposition to parts of the VRA, it was reauthorized, and that law abolished literacy tests nationwide and also lowered the voting age to 18 for all elections, so it enfranchised millions of new voters. The 1975 VRA expanded protections for language minority groups, which was really critical. So it expanded the VRA to Latinos, Asian Americans, Native Americans, other foreign speaking people, and that had 2 effects. One was that it required bilingual ballots all across the country in places where there was significant language minority populations, and it also meant that states with a long history of discrimination against communities like Latinos, such as Texas, were covered under the VRA. So you had some big new states, in particular Texas, who were covered and had to approve their voting changes. And that was huge because Texas has been the most consistent opponent of the VRA and the most consistent violator of the VRA since it was covered in 75. The 1982 reauthorization of the VRA, as I mentioned, amended Section 2 of the VRA so that you just had to prove the effect of discrimination, not the intent. That was huge in terms of electing many, many, many more minority candidates in the decades after that. And the 2006 reauthorization of the VRA, most interestingly enough, was passed 98-0 in the Senate and 39-33 in the House, which is unbelievably dramatic bipartisan numbers. And that act overruled some earlier Supreme Court decisions that had begun to weaken the VRA in the early 2000s. And also it reauthorized it for another 25 years. So the 2006 debate really should have been the end of it for decades. But instead, it was just days after that new challenges to the VRA were launched. And so every time what I show in the book is that every time there's been some real progress on voting rights, there's always a consistent and equally intense effort to roll back that progress.
I'm talking again to Ari Berman, author of the new book, Give Us the Ballot. You can find it at ari-berman.com. Probably one of the more recent instances that many people are well aware of, that you in the book you talk about this, is obviously the 2000 presidential election and how in Florida it was overseen by a man who is currently running for president of the United States, Jeb Bush, and the scandal of Jeb knocking off all types of black voters off the voter rolls. Tell us a little bit about 2000 in Florida.
Well, it's a really dramatic low point in civil rights and in voting rights history. You have the fact that Florida had this voter purge that they drew up. They said that tens of thousands of people were felons who weren't felons. That list was disproportionately African American. African Americans made up 11% of the state's electorate, but 44% of this purge list. And because Florida was one of those states where felons couldn't vote, many, many people showed up on election day. They were told they were felons and they were prevented from voting. And they were disproportionately African American voters. And this was something that the state knew that this purge list was flawed well before the election. They did nothing to try to fix it. Jeb Bush was completely missing in action, even though he was someone who was a very hands-on governor. He was not hands-on in this case. He did nothing to prevent this situation from occurring. And what the head of the U.S., the general counsel of the U.S. Civil Rights Commission that did a huge investigation into the Florida 2000 election and also into the voter purge, told me that he believed that this purge cost Gore the election because so many of the people that were wrongly labeled felons were African Americans, and they voted overwhelmingly for Al Gore. And so this was a situation where, voter suppression really did potentially decide the 2004 election. And I think it set a very chilling precedent for voting rights going forward, because you had both the fact that, Republicans realized that new restrictions could determine the outcome of an election, particularly a close election. Then you had a new Bush administration come in that was incredibly hostile to voting rights. And then you also had people like John Roberts and Sam Alito appointed to the Supreme Court, who would later gut the VRA. So I think really in three distinct ways, Florida 2000 set a very chilling precedent for voting rights.
Before I let you go, following 2010, I think it's like half the states in the country have actually passed further voting restrictions.
Yeah,
it's with the gutting of the Voting Rights Act. I guess the question is, what needs to be done from here? Because in some ways, the VRA and all the amazing things that it did and its immense necessity actually needs to go further than that, correct? And so even before it was gutted, we have all these different types of laws being passed everywhere. What needs to be done to really further enshrine Americans' right to vote, to make sure that every American has the right to vote?
Well, I do think that the VRA needs to be restored, and there's an interesting new bill in the Congress, the Voting Rights Advancement Act of 2015, which I've written about, that would both cover new states based on a more recent history of voting discrimination, while also targeting the new tactics that lead to making it harder to vote. So things like voter ID laws, for example, would be covered under that. The second thing is I do think we need some national standards for our elections, that people shouldn't wait such a long time to vote, that it should be easy to register to vote, that there should be some flexibility in when you vote, so that you don't just have to vote on a Tuesday from 9 to 5. And I think there's a lot of interesting proposals floating around the states right now. Oregon has adopted automatic voter registration where, if you have any sort of interaction with the DMV, you're automatically registered to vote, and then you can opt out. So as opposed to putting the burden on the citizen to register, you're putting the burden on the state, and I think that could be potentially transformative if adopted through the country. Ultimately, 50 million people could be added to the rolls that way, and I think that would have a big impact on increasing voter participation. I think a lot of states 15 states have adopted same-day voter registration. I think that's great. Expanded early voting. I think all of these things would be helpful. I think it's unfortunate that so many states are moving in the opposite direction, that the Congress doesn't seem to think this is a priority for them to deal with. But clearly, there's a number of steps that we could be taking to make it easier to vote. The solutions are already out there. It's just a question of the political will to make it happen.
Ari Berman, author of the new book, Give Us the Ballot, The Modern Struggle for Voting Rights in America. You can find it at ari-berman.com, on Twitter, at Ari Berman. Ari, my friend, I know you've been working on this book for a long time, and I can't recommend it enough. It really does. It reads like a really interesting story, especially considering a lot of the real-life people are throughout it the most. Like obviously we said earlier, John Lewis, essentially the central character in the book. It's really, really interesting to just see and again, we barely even touched on so much in the book about the ongoing struggle through the decades for voting and how necessary it is now. Again, give us the ballot, ari-berman.com. Thank you so much for what you're doing, and thanks for being on the show.
Hey, thanks a lot, Matt.